Hey, this is Ray Siervo, and I'm really excited today. I'm going to take some time today, and we're going to talk with Dr. Richard Howe, who's the Emeritus Professor of Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And Dr. Howe, or as I know him, as he's been just so kind, I call him Richard. He's been a great friend, and I was just thinking today that it was over 20 years that
Hmm.
I first enrolled in Southern Evangelical Seminary and had no idea what I was getting into. Um, and one of the things that I wasn't really crazy about studying was philosophy because I had no idea about what I would have to do. And Richard was just so great, and he's been a great friend. And so, what I want to do is bring Richard in right now. And it's great to have you here, Dr.
Hey,
Howe. And
thank you so much.
um, we're going to talk about philosophy. And I have a frame to put around us to even make us look like
Whew,
we're really
looks pretty
important. This
good. You
is
can't you, you can't put some hair on me while you're at it, can you do that?
I actually
You have a button for that?
I actually probably could if I would have
Yeah,
spent
you
some
probably
time.
could. Yeah, just a little virtual wig.
Yeah. This is like what our classes were like back in the year 2000. My first semester in September of 2000 was ancient to medieval philosophy, and
Oh, I remember those days. Absolutely.
I think there might have been six of us in the class, or maybe a few more.
And I was just
But
making stuff up, I think. Uh,
well, I'm still repeating it. It's
there you go.
it was really something that got my life. We were just talking briefly before, and I said one of the things I remember in one of the readers was reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And for some reason, that just really was the hook that made me start to dig. And of course, at the same time, Dr. Geisler was teaching great thinkers, Thomas Aquinas. And I think that was the last time he taught that course at SES. And
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and so I had to add this role of philosopher somewhere in my mind. I've come to understand that what they do in college today and universities is they teach about philosophy, but they're not teaching people to be philosophers.
Mm.
And that was something that struck me. And you were the first person I thought of to have and as a guest on our show, because this will go up on my YouTube channel as well,
That's
and
great.
hopefully we'll get some ground out of it.
Hopefully
But
you won't be demonetized after after.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I should mention, I should give honorable mention to Richard Howe's brother, Tom Howe, who
Mhm.
was also just a tremendous influence on my life and made me go back and study Greek again.
Mm.
I had taken it back in Bible college back in the 70s with someone who had studied under Machen in
Oh,
Princeton. This
wow.
is how long ago it was. But Greek, I think I know most of the vocabulary, but I still,
Hey, that's the key, man. If you got vocabulary, you're 90% there.
right? And but I still use a lot of tools, and I still get help. And but I just look back, and I'm just so grateful for what Dr. Geisler did with SES, and more
Hmm.
than that, people like yourself and your brother who just helped me get along. I remember we used to meet. I don't know if you remember this, but we used to meet before class. I think it was on a Monday night where I would ask you questions, and we were in that little room in the trailer, and you had
Hmm.
books all over the place. There were like books everywhere, and I would go in there and look and think, man, this is like a cave of books. Like this is just so great. But
That's great.
one of the things that I wanted you to help us with, Richard, is just the role of philosophy. I mean, I understand worldview because I understand philosophy. And I
Mhm.
understand how philosophy really just produces a worldview. And I don't want to take things away from you, but I know you've taught some things and even did some sessions for us at one of my conferences on
Mhm.
how philosophy, um, I guess, helps our theology is the best way to say it. It
Mhm.
and so if you would talk to that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, isn't it a gift that you and I can be able to say that we studied under someone like a Norman Geisler? He was such
Yeah.
a tremendous mentor in my life. I met him as I was a student at Dallas Seminary back in the early 80s.
Hmm.
And back then, not only were there very few seminaries that had more than maybe a couple of courses in apologetics, which had already become my increasing interest and passion as a young Christian. But by the early 80s, I think some seminaries were actually dropping their apologetic courses. I think probably because they didn't know how to respond to postmodernism. So they're like, well, nobody's asking these factual questions anymore. We need to move on.
Right.
And I got a little kind of discouraged while I was a student because the itch wasn't being scratched. I didn't know what that meant, what it
Hmm.
was about being, because I mean, Dallas Seminary to me was the zenith of seminaries, and it was just a dream come true to be a student.
Right.
So I had eventually just quit taking classes, and I was living and working full time in Dallas, Texas, and I was counseling with Dr. Geisler about the direction of my life, and I was considering maybe I need to just table my studies and go with an apologetics ministry. I think Probe Ministries was a big thing, and it still
Right.
is, but it was a big thing there, and it was local. And he gave me some advice, Ray, that really was some of the most important guidance I had ever achieved in my practical Christian life. And he said, well, and he would probably give different advice today, as I'll explain in a second. But he said, what I think you should do is go back to the university and do philosophy. Because what he
Hmm.
realized then, and I only came to realize later, was that though not everything in theology and apologetics is philosophy, obviously, a lot of
Right.
it is. And he
Yeah.
knew, I think today he would be able to say, hey, what you need to do is go to SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I taught, where you studied, because there you were integrating philosophy and apologetics with the theology all together. But he
Right.
couldn't give that kind of advice. There wasn't a such thing as an SES or a Biola or a Houston Baptist or a Liberty or any of these other kinds of schools that are now increasingly noted for their apologetics. So I did begin to learn then how critical philosophy was. In fact, I appreciate the way you worded the topic.
Hmm.
When I do presentations on philosophy, vis-a-vis theology and the Christian life, I have two different titles depending on how suspicious I think my audience might be about the subject of
Yeah.
philosophy. Because I know if the people are reticent to almost hostile, then I will tend to want to label it how philosophy can help your theology. But what I really do mean, and in other contexts, I call the presentation how theology needs
Philosophy.
philosophy, which is
Very
pretty
good. Great.
pretty boastful or ambitious, and certainly self-serving since I am a philosopher by
Yeah.
training. But I think it's really true. And I start out when I try to get people to understand the role that it plays, I try to draw a parallel that I think is relatively uncontroversial from the natural sciences in order to show how the natural sciences in church history have sometimes been instruments in correcting our misunderstanding of scripture.
Right.
And I think I heard Geisler say that sometimes our thinking, whether it's our science or our philosophy, whatever, sometimes that can correct a misunderstanding of Scripture, and then sometimes Scripture can correct a misunderstanding of our understanding of the world.
Right.
So, in the example I use is out of the 16th, 17th century, all of the row that surrounded the solar system and whether the sun was the center of the solar system as
Right.
Copernicus and Galileo were beginning to champion, or whether the earth was. And there was a very interesting argument that Cardinal Bellarmine gave against Galileo to prove biblically that the earth was not moving and that the sun was moving relative to the earth. And it was a passage out of Joshua. Joshua chapter 10, where Joshua commanded the sun to stand still.
Stand still.
And Bellarmine's argument was, well, look, you can't command something to stand still if it's not moving. So obviously, biblically, it's moving. Therefore, this Copernican model is false. Well, we now know that the astronomers have demonstrated that, well, indeed, relative to the sun, it's the earth that's moving because it's orbiting the sun. Okay, so then the question is, well, what do we do with this Joshua 10 passage? Well, we make a hermeneutical move that we were already making with other verses, where we take it as phenomenological or language of appearance, phenomenological language or language of appearance. We say it has the appearance of moving. And it wasn't like we were just making up some hermeneutical principle to shoehorn the Bible in with the latest conclusions of science. No, because we were already using that principle of language of appearance out of Joel 2, when Joel says the moon would turn to blood. And surely nobody, including Robert Bellarmine, didn't believe that the moon was going to become liquid with corpuscles and plasma. Well, why does it say the moon turned to blood? Because it turned red like blood. It had the appearance. And so by parallel, then I go, if it's possible and actual that astronomy can correct on occasion and govern and set boundaries to what we think are proper interpretations of Scripture, if that's the case, then might other disciplines do the same thing, including philosophy? Is it possible, at least in principle, that we could know certain things about the nature of reality by reason that sets boundaries as to what is a plausible interpretation, for example, of a given verse of Scripture? Now, you cut me off when you're ready to move, because I can to some people's consternation, everybody's left the room and I'm still going, where it matters, I think, what really happens. I've had a number of occasions to, not only just in the general marketplace, to try to defend the place at the table that I think philosophy has to have. And it's not everything. I know theology and language and history, they all have things to contribute. But I think the philosopher has fallen into a lot of disrepute in the past few centuries for maybe justifiable reasons, because a lot of the bad things that come out of it. And so I've run into Christians that say, well, isn't really philosophy the problem? I mean, far from being a solution, isn't it the reason why we need sound theology is to stave off the toxins that come from philosophy? I mean, they bring up, Colossians 2:8, for example. Right. Paul says, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and vain deceit. Or they bring up Isaiah 55, that my thoughts are not your thoughts, God says, and my ways are not your ways. So see, God doesn't think the way we think, so we shouldn't have man's reason here. We just need to have God's reasons and stuff. And what I do in the longer presentation is try to defend that, first of all, Paul's not even talking about philosophy as we use that term today, as a discipline of study. That word wasn't really used even in Paul's day as much as it is today. But really, he was, in the context of that verse 8 of chapter 2 of Colossians, was the Colossians were being plagued by an insidious form of legalism, proto-Gnostic legalism. And that was the philosophy he was warning them about, that was going to rob them of their vitality, their Christian life, thinking their sanctification was just a matter of strict rules that they had to obey. And he says, now that's not going to do it. And also, if I may, the Isaiah 55 passage there, my thoughts are not your thoughts. He's not telling the reader that his thoughts are not the thoughts of the reader, as if you're reading it as one of his children. In the context, he's contrasting his thoughts and his ways with the thoughts and ways of the wicked and unrighteous. Right. So that passage in Isaiah 55 is making a moral statement, not a statement about logic and reason. And one other sort of preliminary thought, at least one others I think about it. I had the pleasure of being in a panel discussion back in 2013 with K. Scott Oliphant, the premier apologist from Westminster Seminary, and Jason Lyle, a astrophysicist. And we had this panel discussion. We did a written debate discussion, and then we did a
Right.
live panel. And one of the things we were talking about was apologetic method, presuppositional versus classical, which invariably then brings in the specter of the legitimacy or lack thereof of philosophy. And Scott Oliphant raised an objection. He said, well, the problem with thinking that theology needs philosophy, as my more ambitious title would suggest, is that it seems to then make it sort of elitist. If you're saying there's some philosophy that's necessary for some aspects of theology, and I'm going to try to give an example of that, Ray, with your indulgence here in just a second.
Absolutely.
But if we say that theology somehow needs philosophy, Scott was arguing, then to the degree that a given Christian either doesn't have the inclination or maybe the aptitude to do philosophy, to that degree, then, Scott was arguing, you're making apologetics and theology out of bounds. They can't really do it because they don't do philosophies. And so that was the criticism. You're making it elitist, as if we got to go to the philosophical magisterium to find out where the boundaries and guardrails are so we don't overstep them. And I thought about his criticism, and he actually leveled that in the print version. And I thought about that, and here's what I came up with, and I think he was completely underwhelmed by my response, but nevertheless. I said, well, look, think about if a parent, a mother asks her child to go pick a flower. Hey, honey, go pick a flower and bring it to mommy. Well, assuming that the child is old enough to understand the word flower and mommy and that kind of stuff, that the child knows what a flower is and knows who mommy is, and she's able to walk out into the yard, pick a flower, and bring it to mommy. She's not going to go pick up a pile of dog poop and put it in the garbage disposal. She knows what these things mean. However, and this is just an analogy I'm going to apply to philosophy. Suppose somebody started to ask deeper questions about the plant that flower grows on, or the mommy, like say, well, what is it? What is this plant? You know, how does it grow? What are its
Right.
how does it behave during the seasons and stuff? It's likely you're going to have to study some botany, right? Well, now, is the child going to know botany? No. Is that elitist? No. All we're saying is she can understand a flower, she can understand mommy, but if you're going to delve deeper into some of these things, you might need to study botany, or if you're going to get into the photosynthesis, you might need to do chemistry, or if you're going to get into the subatomic particles, you might need to do physics. And obviously that gets more and more elitist, if you will, and out of bounds for the child. But all we're saying is, hey, just as there are deeper levels of the physical world that might require some kind of specialized training, might that be the case for the philosophical realm? Because after all, how do you know what is a flower? Or if you just ask the question, what is the difference between a plant and a human? Well, that discussion is going to invariably involve metaphysics, that a plant has a certain nature and a human has a certain nature. Well, what's a nature? And there's no such thing as nature. That's a philosophical and more narrowly a metaphysical question. Well, how do I know the difference between a plant and a human? That's going to be epistemology, the study of how we know things. Why do we value a human more than we value the plant? Well, because of their different natures. And should we value one more than the other? Well, that discussion, now it obviously is theological too. I'm not eliminating that angle, but I'm saying there's an aspect of it that's philosophical, and that's what we call ethics. And not only do we individually hopefully value the human more than the plant, but collectively we require our fellow humans in our community to value the human more than a plant. And we don't tolerate people that treat humans as if they would treat a potted plant. Well, then that's political philosophy is what that is. How does that power work with the community, and how does it impose its will on the individual to require people to value a human more? That's what political philosophy is all about. We as Christians know that the plant can't explain its own existence. The human can't explain its own existence, and ultimately needs God to explain why they even exist in the first place. Some people don't think so. Let's have that discussion. What is that? That's philosophy of religion. So you could just go down the levels of different aspects of the world around us. And so the punchline is this. You don't need philosophy to do theology. But there are certain aspects of reality, including the aspects of reality that theology touch on, that a deeper analysis of that is going to be philosophy. So if you don't want to do that deeper analysis, that's fine. But you can't have it both ways. You can't weigh in on whether there is a such thing as a human nature, what the theologian calls a soul, that argues for the sanctity of life in the womb, as we would do, to say the zygote is a human, and we got to be able to make that argument. Well, that's a philosophical and metaphysical argument. If our fellow Americans don't regard the authority of the Bible, then we might not be able to have the luxury of appealing to Scripture to prove to them the sanctity of life. But I would also add quickly, we don't have the luxury to wait until every other American gets saved before we can advocate for the sanctity of life in the womb.
Right.
Which means then there's got to be some common ground according to which we can engage people that don't regard the authority of special revelation from God, that through his prophets and apostles and the incarnation and the Lord Jesus Christ. We've got to have some kind of common ground. And I submit to you, that's what philosophy begins to give us, that common ground, at least an in-depth analysis of certain things, give us that, or at least lead us into this discipline we call philosophy. Now, what I'd like to do before we're done, with your permission, is to really get into the why this matters, what's really at stake. Because so far I've sort of been speaking maybe in some generalities, except maybe the abortion thing. But I want to show people why it's relevant. But I want to make sure I'm not getting too long-winded here before you have another question. And I want to do my product placement as I take a sip of coffee. So, I just surreptitiously pick up my Southern Evangelical Seminary mug while I'm drinking some coffee in your honor.
Am I getting feedback?
Now, that was me talking on top of you.
No. For me, even though I went on and did my DMin in apologetics, I still say that it was my master's in apologetics that really was the backbone of everything I did, even though some people might think, well, the doctorate's a higher degree. I would say, well, I would do the master's over again. And so many people who come to me and say, what do you think of the DMin in apologetics at SES? And I say, well, it's good. I said, do you have any apologetics in your background? Because you'll learn the practical things and do some practical things in the DMin. This might be an advertisement for people. But the master's in apologetics really was everything. And plus I had to do another 20 hours in order to qualify for the DMin because I only had 60. But I was free to choose whatever I wanted in that extra 20 hours. So I picked subjects that I thought would really help me, either biblically, in some biblical studies, or things in philosophy that I wouldn't normally take. Like, I think one of the courses I took with you after that was a classical apologetics, where we look back at the Thomistic side of apologetics and Aquinas's view of reality. And I don't have a degree in philosophy, but I think that I learned a lot, enough where I know I talk to people who've studied philosophy and know some of the ins and outs of where they are and where they're going just from my degree in apologetics. Now, I know SES has split off philosophy now into its own degree, so you can get an MA in philosophy from SES.
Right.
And they've, I guess, changed some things around in the apologetics thing, because I had a lot of philosophy in that, especially studying with yourself, even your brother Tom, and of course Dr. Geisler. It was riddled with it. And even studying, having that one course on apologetics, on Thomas Aquinas, he made us produce a paper that we had to give to the rest of the class. We had to write a 15-page paper, and here I was, like, totally new, a newbie completely, and I'm thinking of all the things that we studied in his book, and The other one was the Penguin Classic on Thomas Aquinas, selected
Hmm.
writings of Thomas Aquinas, and I swear it was 6-point type in the book. And
I
and
know that book. I know exactly.
here I am trying to read this thing, thinking like I know every word in this paragraph, but I have no idea what he's talking about. And it wasn't until Max Herrera and David Mendez and I took a ride to South Carolina to a Catholic bookstore where I found a little book by, it was a Father O'Donnell. I'm trying to think,
Hmm.
it might have been Robert O'Donnell, wrote a book called Hooked on Philosophy. And the
Hmm.
subtitle was The Thought of Thomas Aquinas. And I thought, this should be given to everyone who comes to
Hmm.
SES because he went through and explained all of Thomas's words, his terms. And
Oh,
suddenly
wow.
it was like getting a language book, that translated phrases for you, like so you could
Yes.
get to the bathroom and you could find the restaurant, you could read the time schedule for the train. So, and I was like a little kid in a candy shop. And yeah, that
That's
and
great.
because of my background, I think I loved the theological points of Thomas. I thought they were
Hmm.
like mind blowing. I thought his insight into the person and character of God, I still do, were just outstanding. And so I remember talking with Dr. Geisler about it, is that I went not toward the Maritans and the Gilles Sans, even though I read those books.
Hmm.
I was going after Garrigou Lagrange because he was more the theological side of things. And
Hmm.
I still remember reading one of his books on, it wasn't the one on predestination, it was the one on providence, where
Hmm.
he discusses what eternity is and how,
Wow.
you know, um, I remember just kind of sitting there reading this book thinking like, oh my gosh, like of all the things I've read and studied, and I've never heard anybody so clear on this not being a succession of moments and not a
Hmm.
boundary of God to any kind of, yeah. And
Yeah.
it really just, I remember when the first time I came back to New Jersey to visit, I had a vocabulary that somebody was saying, English, please. Like, because, you start living in that realm. And I, I should tell you this too. I talk with David Mendez every once in a while, and Max, and of course Max is just in another category all by
He
himself.
really is. Oh, yeah.
But I would say there are three things that I never get into the weeds on. I don't golf, but I know golfing you don't want to get into the weeds, and the other one is fishing. You don't want to get into the weeds. And the other one
Hmm.
is philosophy, is that I'd never get into the weeds because I can't parse things anew. I think I get it, but I know the time investment that people like yourself have put into understanding the differences and what we call Thomism or what's called
Hmm.
Thomism is really holding on to the classical view of philosophy, and that is the love of wisdom and
Amen.
looking for the right way to find the good, the true, and the beautiful in life, and being able to discern what isn't good, beautiful, and true based on the nature of reality. And
Hmm.
that's my best understanding. If I could encapsulate my understanding of philosophy and the things that I spend my time trying to help people understand, that maybe we need another word, or we need that modifier of classical philosophy or
Hmm.
Thomistic philosophy,
Yes.
or something to classify it against wrangling over words, which is what's going on and what's happened to us. I think we've been overtaken by a postmodern view of reality
Hmm.
that's morphed into critical theory is the way that I would understand it. And culturally, that
Absolutely.
gets my attention. And it's the moderate realism or the Thomistic philosophy that keeps me grounded
Absolutely.
in what I
Absolutely.
understand of it, and not get swayed and not, I it was such a blessing to do it, and it's really given me enough to continue on. As we were talking earlier, my lane, if I could say that, has gone into the resurrection, based
Oh,
on the
excellent.
reliability of the eyewitnesses. If I could
Mm,
summarize what I really feel strongly about, and I feel like that reaches church people um, enough to where I can bring philosophy into it, and
yes.
you know things you've taught me and things that Dr. Geisler taught me is really how to think critically, how to be a good critical thinker, and
Absolutely.
hear those things. And for those things, I'm just so grateful. And the church just isn't up to speed. And my mission here in New Jersey and in South Africa, for that matter,
Hmm.
is to help people understand these things, try to give them
Absolutely.
some things.
Absolutely.
Um,
Well, I really appreciate the ministry that you've had, not only there in New Jersey that you allowed me to be a small part of in the past, and I appreciated that, but also how much you mean to the saints in South Africa. And I've been there a number of times myself, not probably as many as you, but I've garnered some relationships, and I actually have a sort of a mentor slash discipleship relationship with two young men there in philosophy. We meet on Friday mornings through Zoom, and
great,
we've
that's
been
wonderful.
meeting sporadically. Now we've decided let's just make it a regular thing. So yeah, God's doing some amazing things through Simon and Nell Brace and their team through the Ratio Christi down there. So the thing is, as you were talking there, and I'm thinking and processing, uh, there's been a lot of renaissance of the enthusiasm about a philosophy within contemporary apologetics with people
Hmm.
like a William Lane Craig or a Paul Copan or Doug Guyvet, these premier philosophical thinkers. But at the same time, or maybe not at the same time, but as a parallel kind of increasing mindset, this classical subset of philosophy, not just philosophy generally, but a particular kind of partisan philosophy that we're noted for at SES, is getting mixed reactions.
Hmm.
And one of the things I think, and by mixed, I mean some people are pretty enthusiastic about it. Others, and I'm speaking primarily of evangelicals, almost have an allergic reaction. They start breaking out and itching and there's a reason for that. Um, this classical method that we've identified, you find it prevalent. I mean, from Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria, Augustine. But the thing is, whatever constitutes that particular denomination or partisan kind of way of looking at things that we call classical philosophy, as opposed to, as you've already done, analytic philosophy that we experience today, you see that it endured in Christian thinking beyond the Protestant Reformation.
Right.
So, in longer versions of these conversations, I give examples from John Calvin or John Owen or Francis Turretin or Stephen Charnock, even some of the Princeton guys, people like Charles Hodge, are disciples of the Princeton guys like James Pettigrew Boyce, all making this point, namely that for reasons that are interesting if you like philosophy, other philosophical influences began to steer Protestant Christianity away from this classical approach. So that today, predominantly, the only place you're going to find predominantly this classical Thomistic philosophy is among Catholic Christians.
Yeah.
So then that makes Protestants generally and evangelicals especially nervous because they
Hmm.
think it's Catholic. They think, oh, well, if I start reading Aquinas, then the next thing I know, you're going to be lobbying for the perpetual virginity of Mary and transubstantiation and the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. And you go, no, no, that's not what we're doing any more than Calvin thought that, any more than Charnock or Turretin or any of these these Protestant and Puritan giants, they realized there was not only not an incompatibility against the philosophy in this Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, but that it was actually undergirded what we cherish the most about that tradition. And the thing that another accusation or concern that people have given me off and on over the years is just well, what is it? Why is it relevant? What's at stake? Now, maybe there's some esoteric philosophical thing that the philosophers get all excited about, and that matters to you guys. But what about the rest of us in the body of Christ? Why should we care? And the example that I go to, I give one example that's extreme in order to see the principle, and then another example that's quite subtle in order to see the danger. And the extreme example that most people go, well, that's not us, so we're not worried about that, but at least illustrates the principle, is the Dake Annotated Reference Bible. So Finus Jennings Dake, you're familiar with him. Anybody that does countercult ministry probably knows the name Finus Jennings Dake. The thing about the Dake Study Bible, in his marginal commentary, there's a place in there where he just lobbies explicitly that God has a spirit body, that he goes around the universe just as other spirit beings do, that he has all of these bodily parts like lips and hair and tongue and mouth and arms and eyes and these kind of things. And when I'm doing my full presentation with the eye candy of the PowerPoint, and I have this quote from Dake where he's listing all these body parts, and I asked the audience rhetorically, there's something else that bothers me about this citation I have on the screen. And they're kind of wondering what it might be. They're picking out, maybe you don't like the fact that God has hair. Maybe that's what you don't like, or you don't like the fact that Dake thinks God has lips or whatever. And what I do is on the next slide, all of the words of Dake disappear, and what's left behind are all the biblical citations that Dake deals to. Yeah, because I think if Dake was here today, he'd go, look, if you don't believe God has eyes, then what do you do with the verse that says, the eyes of the Lord roam to and fro on the earth? Or my favorite go-to is Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And you mentioned my brother Tom, who's probably been the biggest influence in my life, right up there with Geisler. And I had to call him up. Everybody needs a Hebrew scholar on their speed dial.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So I didn't bother learning Hebrew. I know it goes right to left. That was as far as I got in Hebrew. That was it for me. So I called Tom up and I go, well, the English is ambiguous. It says, and they heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Who's walking? Are they walking in the garden and they hear the sound of God? Or are they hearing the sound of God walking in the garden? So he looked at the Hebrew. No, it's not ambiguous in the Hebrew. It's God is walking in the garden. I said, okay, good. So I used this example. I asked a friend of mine at church, and he and I pretty much thought the same about this. I was just using him as a sounding board. And I asked him, I said, well, Genesis 3 says God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Do you believe God has legs? He said, well, no, I don't believe God has legs. Well, it says he's walking. You can't walk without legs. Snakes don't walk. I said, why don't you believe God has legs? He said, well, because John 4, Jesus says God is spirit. And those who worship him worship him in spirit and truth. I said, okay, so what do you do with the Genesis 3 passage where it says God is walking? He said, well, I take that as a figure of speech. And my question was, how do you know the John 4 passage isn't the figure of speech?
Right.
The text doesn't tell you which one. Is God properly a spirit and he only figuratively walks? Or does he properly walk and he's only figuratively a spirit? I mean, after all, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 tells us, brethren, if any among you are overtaken in a trespass, let you who are spiritual among you go and restore him. Well, spiritual there is just the adjective form of the noun spirit.
Right.
Do you think Paul was telling them, hey, those of you who are immaterial in the Galatian church, you go restore you. So the elders of the church come floating down the church. No, you understand that something could be spiritual and still be physical. In fact, you mentioned the resurrection. This is a plague of liberal theology. They keep taking the fact that a body is raised a spiritual body to erroneously think that it was raised an immaterial body. Right. So I go, so that's not enough. Just the word spirit's not going to help us adjudicate. My suggestion is that the only way that we can know when the Bible is or isn't speaking figuratively about God is illustrated, I think. Let me just bring in another passage, if I may. Isaiah 55 again. Isaiah 55 says, the trees shall clap their hands. Isaiah's talking about this triumphant eschaton when the kingdom of God comes in its fullness. The trees will clap their hands. Now, when we read that, we know that Isaiah is speaking figuratively or metaphorically. But how do we know that? We know that because we know enough about the nature of a tree such that they don't literally have hands. All right. Well, how do we know the nature of a tree? Well, that's an interesting philosophical question, but the short answer is you see enough trees as you grow up, your intellect is able to identify tree so that you know what tree is. You know they don't literally have hands. They might poetically have hands. Right. Okay, fine. My suggestion, Ray, to your viewers is that in principle, we've got to be able to do that about the nature of God, that we have to have some way to know enough about the nature of God to know when the special revelation from God is speaking properly and is speaking poetically or metaphorically. Right. The problem is we can't just go out and see God and go, well, I guess God doesn't have legs after all. I guess that is a figure of speech in Genesis 3. No, we can't do that. But what I think we can do is exactly what Paul tells us in Romans 1, particularly verse 20, where Paul tells us that in this kind of quirky language here, the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood through the things that are made. And what I challenge my students is, okay, so how do you get from what you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell? Those are the things that are made that we can see and such. How do you get from that to a God who has all of these superlative attributes, eternal, timeless, spacious, unchanging, simple, impassible, all good, all powerful, all loving, all of them? How do you get from that to that? Well, normally, without the deleterious effects of the fall, the way you get to that is just encounter the creation. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19 says. The heavens declare his righteousness, Psalm, I think, 97 says. The works of the law are written on the heart, Romans chapter 2. God's providential superintendence of the history of the human race, Acts 14. That's the principal normal way. The problem is there's so many bad philosophical and religious thinking that has polluted our the way we try to reason with these things, that now it takes, and again, this is the self-serving part, it takes a concerted effort in some situations to get people to see how what you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell entails that there's the God of classical theism. And that process, among other things, is going to be what we find in metaphysics, in philosophy of religion. It just is. Just like an argument about whether a given plant will or won't survive in New Jersey versus Florida is something that botanists or people trained in botany can inform you about. And so that's the principle. Now, the other example I just want to throw out that was at the other end of the spectrum, because I gave the Dake as an example. And Simon Brace helped me realize, he said, that's a good example, but the problem with using Dake to make your point is that most evangelicals are going to go, yeah, Dake, who does that? That's wacky, nutty kind of fringe heresy. So we're not really in danger. None of us are tempted to go get a Dake study Bible. He said, what you need to do is give an example from like Gregory Boyd and open theism. He said, that hits a lot closer to home. And I do a presentation, Ray, maybe someday in the future when you run out of guests and you have to start recycling some of us, you can have me back on. I do a presentation titled God Fading Away. And what I do there is give a historical, from the church fathers to contemporary theologians, a picture of the classical attributes of God and how this sort of relatively uniform picture of what God is like in omnipotence, omniscience, timeless, spaceless, and all those things. And then I try to show how within evangelicalism, not the heretics, but within evangelicalism, those attributes are beginning to fade.
Hmm.
So that now you've got, say, some open theists who, in effect, will reject the traditional view of God's omniscience. They'll say they still believe in omniscience, but they don't think omniscience includes that God knows the future actions of free creatures. Now, Gregory Boyd, bless his heart, he's a scholar. He's a godly man from everything I know, well respected. He's not a sort of kooky the way some people might think Finus Jennings Dake was. He will appeal to the scripture, say, look, when Abraham was offering Isaac and he's about to plunge the knife because God tells him to sacrifice his son. And then the angel stops him and God says, now I know. Now I know. And Gregory Boyd says, see, God didn't know whether Abraham actually did have the faith to believe. And so he had to wait and see if Abraham was actually really going to go through it. And that's how God knows. And you see a lot of places where God says, what the scriptures say, well, now I know, implying, well, did God not know? I thought he was omniscient. Right. So my plea is, if we cherish these attributes of God, then we've got to be able to deal with those verses that seem to describe God in finite human terms. There are places in the historical narratives of the Old Testament where God moves around. He talks about being moved around in the tabernacle. I thought he was omnipresent. How could he be moved around all of a sudden? Right. So the short answer is, I think the problem that plagues some of us is bad metaphysics, whatever that ends up looking like. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I appeal to people going, look, we didn't used to have to make these arguments. Nobody failed in church history to realize that when you look up at the starry sky, there was an eternal, all-powerful, all-good creator. But you can get disabused of that by reading a Richard Dawkins or a Michael Martin or a George Smith or any number of popular and academic atheists, or the cults, the Mormons or whatever, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who to greater or lesser degrees reject these classical attributes. And that's sort of my hook, to say, if we care about classical, what we call classical theism, these classical attributes that we've cherished for centuries, if we care about those, we better start making sure we know how to triage the conversation to be able to lobby and argue for how we know they're true beyond just the exegesis. Because if you do the exegesis and you think, oh, I don't really care about philosophical assumptions, then you won't be able to stave off the argument of Dake on the one end, or even the argument of a Boyd on the other. In fact, he actually accuses us, said, the problem with you guys is your philosophy. I don't really do philosophy. And I'm just going, no, you're doing philosophy. You just exchanged mine for yours, basically. You've exchanged one metaphysic for another metaphysic. You're not free from these philosophical assumptions.
Yeah, I find that people think that they're somehow staving away from philosophy, but making philosophical statements all the time, and don't realize that what they're doing is making philosophical, they're making metaphysical statements because
Absolutely.
They're talking about the nature of something, or how things are known. I find that more than not, when people are talking, especially about who God is, they're
absolutely.
And
it's funny. Gregory Boyd in his book God of the Possible, mm-hmm. He does a Q&A at the end of his book, to kind of flesh out potential objections to his view. And someone brings up the idea of, well, what about figures of speech? What about figurative language about God? And if you will allow, let me tell you what he says from his book. He said, there's certainly passages in the Bible that are figurative and portray God in human terms. So you go, okay, so how would we know them? And here's what he says. You can recognize them because what is said about God is either ridiculous if taken literally, or because the genre of the passage is poetic. Well, okay, so ridiculosity then becomes my criterion, or at least one criteria that he says. But then I would just go, well, to a classical theist, it sounds ridiculous to me to think that God doesn't know the future actions of free creatures. In fact, I would submit to you, that sounded ridiculous to all the systematic theologians that you could access. I mean, that's what I do in my God Fading Away. Look at what these guys say, and look at their list of these attributes of God. They all would take the idea that God can't know what a free creature is going to do in the future. They would take that as ridiculous. So now ridiculosity just becomes so useless, because what you consider to be plausible or not, or ridiculous or not, can very often just be an effect of a previous philosophical commitment that you've either consciously or unconsciously made. And so we're back to where we're going. Now we got to argue the metaphysics again that you thought we were all free from, but it turns out we're actually not free from after all.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that again, for me, I don't think I ever would have gotten into anything close to philosophy without going to SES. And I remember the first time I took a module there. Both times, my first two modules, I was still living here in New Jersey, and traveled down to Charlotte to take classes. And both times, Dr. Geisler had me stay at his house.
Oh yeah.
And
That's great.
I still remember him taking me over to his bookshelf and saying, this is all he said to me. He said, "These are my best philosophy books." And it was just like, really, I had enough sense to read between the lines and say, he's saying, read these books.
That's great.
I didn't have a cell phone back then. I would have just been snapping pictures of the books,
Yeah, exactly.
going down. But yeah, it was really important. My first weekend there, he still owned that house up in the mountains, and Gary Habermas was teaching apologetics, and he took Gary and me. So here I am with these two giants in the faith, spending a weekend basically sitting at the table with them, and Gary's reading letters from atheists who, he's debated. Anthony Flew. He had one letter from Anthony Flew.
Oh wow!
And at the end of the letter, Anthony Flew says, "Pray for me." It's just
wow.
Yeah, he has the letter, and I remember it was typewritten. It was written on a typewriter, and so, yeah. So it affected me deeply, and I wanted to learn more than anything how to defend my faith, to help at that time to talk to college students, because we were losing so many of them to the soft sciences as well as the hard sciences. And postmodernism was kind of at that place where it had climbed, but now it was starting to tail off, but it was really morphing into something else.
Oh, absolutely.
It's still, it's won over so many people.
Absolutely. Well, that reminds me, when we think about things, and another kind of hook that I do to get people to at least pause long enough to consider that there might be some legitimate role that philosophy needs to play in the conversation, is I said, okay, so let's say we believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, as most, or at least many evangelicals still hold. But you can't believe the Bible is inerrant if you don't know what an error is. You can't say the Bible doesn't have errors if you don't know what an error is. But I would submit you can't know what an error is if you don't know what truth is.
Yeah.
But what truth is a philosophical question. It just is. Again, we didn't maybe need to lobby too hard for that, because nobody didn't know what that meant. If you said, I believe the Bible is true, you might find people that say, well, I don't believe that the Bible is true, but everybody knew what everybody meant. Today, well, I believe Christianity is true. That may just mean, I think asparagus tastes good. And I'm happy you like asparagus. I prefer Brussels sprouts, as if that's true for you, not for me, kind of thing. Well, no, that's not what I meant. And now it's even worse. It's morphed. I think you're exactly right. It's a good way to put it. It's sort of, the novelty wore off of some of the early versions of postmodernism. Now it's really infected and morphed into this critical theory, to where now even the idea of the laws of logic and the role of evidence and argument are now considered racist if you employ those in any kind of social discourse. That's just Western and racist and white, or whatever, however they're going to characterize it. Yeah. And you go, wow, we can't just rest on the fact that our fellow members of our culture or our country our Western civilization or anything else. We can't rest on the fact that, well, everybody kind of knows where the boundaries are and what the categories are. No, the very foundation itself is being chipped away. And the only way to sustain an argument, if we're going to sustain an argument, is to lobby for some of these foundational things we didn't used to have to lobby for. I think that's why philosophy is now seeing, in principle, a sort of comeback in some circles in apologetics, because people are realizing, yeah, I guess we can't avoid the philosophical questions anymore.
No.
And thank God there have been a lot of great apologists that God has raised up who are philosophically trained, like a Bill Craig or Paul Copan or Doug Geivett or others we could name, and of course Norm Geisler prior to that, and others. And then as a subset of that, we go, okay, fine, we got everybody sold on the project. Now let's see if we can shore it up and make it as strong as we can. And that's why we argue for this classical tradition, I call it, because that sounds fairly innocuous, doesn't it? Oh yeah, I'm a classical philosopher. Okay, well that's nice.
That sounds good.
Or if you want to sound more partisan, you can say the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, or Thomistic, or Scholastic. There's a lot of different words, or moderate realism, as it was called in earlier literature. Exactly. So there's a lot of different terms to use to make this lobby for this classical realism that we think that's the philosophy it has to be. Philosophy's fine, but unless it's really good philosophy, it's not really going to deliver. Unless it's the right vaccine, you're not going to be protected from COVID-19, right? It's not just anything you can inject. It's got to be the right. So we think this classical method is the vaccine against these intellectual toxins that are surrounding us.
I've got a great one for you. I don't know if you saw this. I know that there was something on. I saw it in the New York Post, but the Oregon Department of Education has gotten a toolkit. Listen to this. This gets really good for middle school students, because they want to they want to make math de-racist. And yeah, it gets really good. So this toolkit is put together because of the pressure that there's only one right answer.
Oh yes, I've been hearing about this. This is crazy.
Yeah, and so they want the teachers to come up with 2 or 3 alternatives that might be acceptable to be the answer. Now, could you imagine? I mean, just arithmetic having 2 or 3 alternatives, and they want to. There was one more thing in this toolkit. What they want to do is to not have the kids have to show their work in order to be graded. So in other words,
I had that when I was in school.
Right? I was going to say I'd have passed all my math classes. But you think about it, do these people get on an elevator and think, I wonder if there was only one right answer in the engineering to make this thing go up and down, or drive over a bridge and say, imagine that there was some other answer. We don't have to get the right answer in calculus or in physics to understand the weight of the trucks and going across this bridge. I mean, it's just insanity. But it's, to me, what I saw was something that I believe it was Aristotle who was talking about taking one area of knowledge and trying to apply it to another area of knowledge. And you're taking the means of understanding this and trying to put it on that. And so in the soft sciences where postmodernism really got its foothold, now they're trying to make it something that fits into the hard sciences. And
absolutely.
There'll be a war there.
Thankfully, reality is what it is, and the boundaries are there, and it's not possible to flout them completely. I always used to get tickled by heavy metal bands, which I like heavy metal music as a genre, and I was real into the heavy metal scene of the Christian versions and stuff. But I always thought it was funny, these secular heavy metal bands that were, say, satanic, and they were flouting convention, and we're just going to assault everything. They still had to plug their amplifiers in 110 volts in the U.S. or it's not going to work. I don't care how rebellious you are. That electricity is going to set the boundaries. Well, I think that there are philosophical truths that set boundaries. Like, for example, can you imagine if you asked the teacher who was trying to say, hey, we need to get away from there's one right answer. And they go, okay, so what about the question, do you think it's right and okay for one race to enslave another race? And see if she thinks there's one right answer about that. Well, of course she has to think that. Except for people that are just corrupt, like a Hitler or whatever, nobody doesn't know that that's true. Right. Then there are some objective truths about reality we can't afford practically to just throw away, like the very racism that you want us to believe you care about. But you wouldn't even know what racism is if you couldn't contrast it with something that's not racist. So it's just, Rebecca and I talk about, my wife Rebecca and I, we'll get into these conversations, seeing something on TV. And over the past years, so many times I've seen the Frankenstein monster story just repeated. You remember the basic, as I understand it, the basic thrust of the story was that the guy overstepped his bounds of trying to be God and created a creature that lived that eventually kills him. And I think this kind of toxin, this postmodernism and some of the critical theory and some of this really radical
good illustration.
It's creating these monsters that's going to start coming right back on them. I don't mean kill them physically. I just mean in terms of the cogency and coherency of their very worldview is just going to collapse in on itself if people reflect on it deeply enough.
Yeah. I go back to that Oregon thing with the Department of Education. They said that math was inherently wrong because it was objective. It was strictly objective. So that's what made it wrong. And they had to take the racism out of it because that's what they think racism is built on.
I mean, I wonder if I would do this. I think about it hypothetically. I wonder if it would work in an actual practical situation. If somebody said, well, we need to take the racism out of math. And I go, so you think we should put the racism as much as we can into the math? Is that what you're saying? No, I'm saying we should take it out. Okay, so you say we should take it, you should put it in. And every time they say something, say the exact opposite as if that's what you think they mean. And see how long it takes them to come to the realization, I guess there is a difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying, that they're mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. Well, okay, if they can't both be true, now it's just a matter of finding what is true and what is not true. Which is what we were already doing. What is true and what's not true in any given thing. Right. And sure, there may be some things that aren't objectively true, like my asparagus and Brussels sprouts.
Right.
I love asparagus, but I think Brussels sprouts didn't even come into existence until after the fall. Okay. I think the Hebrew word for the thorns and thistles is actually the Hebrew word for Brussels sprouts.
Brussels sprouts.
But people disagree. That's fine. Some people might like a certain vegetable and not. That kind of subjectivity is perfectly normal. But that can't be true of everything in the world, like the laws of logic or what is or isn't racism, what is or isn't good and evil. We can't just throw that out as if, there is no right answer to the question about racism. Well, that's the one thing everybody cares about, seemingly. So obviously you got to know what is and what isn't racism to even act, what you're going to eliminate, hopefully. So you won't just be throwing out the good with the bad.
Yeah. Oh, Richard, the only thing that's missing is we're not sitting across a table with a meal in front of us and maybe even having our wives there with us to just kind of look at us. And I know mine would look at me and say, what?
Mine would be correcting my grammar and then probably straightening all, like this and, saying you need to shave or whatever, she watches out for me at every level, from the intellectual all the way down to the to how well my tie is fitting or whatever.
Joanna
I couldn't get along without her.
Joanna look at me sometimes after I go off on something that I see on television, and she'll say, "Do you really understand what you're saying?"
I think Barbara used to say that about Norm Geisler.
Oh, gosh.
That she'd proofread his stuff and she'd go back to him, and he's told this joke before, that she would just, or even she's told it. She's like, do you even know what this means? I mean, are you just making this up? It's just hilarious.
Well,
So,
we've actually let an hour go by, Richard, maybe a little bit more. But I had one question come up that was really on topic, and it was,
mhm.
what's a good starting point for someone wanting to go back and further their education in this area? You know,
Yes.
um,
So, let me just mention two resources. My master's thesis director at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, when I did my MA in philosophy, is a man named William Lawhead. And he's written a history of philosophy called Voyage of Discovery.
yeah,
And I've gotten more comments about how helpful that's been to students than almost any other single textbook I've ever assigned. I've told him this
hmm,
more than once, and he was very heartened by that. Including students in South Africa that have gotten a hold of it and are not necessarily a textbook. So it's a great sort of overview in a historical fashion, from the early thinkers all the way up to contemporary. So it gives you a good pegboard to begin to hook things as you get
right,
a little bit more details. And then I would love people to read Edward Fazer book titled Aquinas. It's a very manageable paperback, small. It's
yep,
part of a series called Beginner's Guides, and he wrote the Beginner's Guides on Aquinas, on John Locke, and on philosophy of mind.
hmm,
And that would give one just a taste of, okay, now let's get into some partisan issues beyond just what did Locke think or what did Descartes think or what did Plato. That's fine, and you need that. But then how can I begin to judge about the plausibility and the truthfulness of various options that are out there? And so, unashamedly, no bait and switch for me. I tease the students. Look, I try to force feed you the Thomistic Kool-Aid. I turn you into one of the pods. If you're familiar with the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I do all of that. No bait and switch. So I think Fazer's book is just tremendous. Introductory. Here are the issues broadly in this classical philosophy, in this Aristotelian Thomistic tradition that has occupied such a large segment of Christian thinking for centuries, really since the church fathers to greater or lesser extent, because he's building on the thinkings of people like Plato and Aristotle and other early Greek thinkers.
yeah.
So Lawhead's Voyage of Discovery and then uh, Fazer's Aquinas, I think, are a couple of good places to start.
Yeah, I think we used Voyage of Discovery when we studied classical philosophy, and there was a reader also. I have it on my shelf upstairs that we read of their actual writings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah,
And Lawhead will have excerpts from various philosophers. And there are other textbooks that accompany larger segments of readings and stuff. And a lot of those readings are accessible in pretty cheap little
yeah,
Kindle versions, even in English translation.
right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. I still go back to Lawhead's book and in the Voyage of Discovery because, like you
Mm.
say, it just gives you a place to hang all these things. You get to know the names and the period. And one of the things that I love about philosophy or studying philosophy is to look at the history of thought and just to
Mm-hmm.
see. It's kind of like historical theology.
Absolutely.
You look at the way theology kind of became something else. I hesitate to use the word evolve, but how it grew or morphed or did one of those other
Yes.
things. But just the understanding of how the philosophical thought impacted the world, and even like I'm trying to think of the guy's name now who wrote The Victory of Reason. As a Catholic historian, it'll come to me. But he talks about how reason really saved Western civilization in the Middle Ages. That
Absolutely.
and Yeah, he's a prolific writer, and for
In
some reason,
fact, Ray, you may be familiar with Robert Riley's text, "The Closing of the Muslim Mind,"
no, I haven't
because
seen it.
he tries to show the difference between the Christians in the Middle Ages who are grappling with the faith reason issue and the Muslims, particularly Sunni Islam, wrestling also, and
Hmm.
how two different resolutions of the relationship has led to the Christian Europe developing and Muslim civilization being largely arrested uh, from its
Right.
prior express,
That
and
was,
it's a tremendous historical reconnaissance. Same issue, and this issue of faith and reason is another philosophical issue that I
it
think needs
is.
some triage today because there's so much misunderstanding about the two. That's another thing we could spend another hour on some of these other issues like that. So
Yeah,
absolutely,
absolutely.
yeah.
I did a seminar. I think it was, oh gosh, it's before COVID, but on faith and reason, and just
Mm,
the way that we misunderstand both of them in so many ways. We don't deal with them. I'm trying to think of the
mm-hmm.
name of that book, but there
Right.
was like three different views, or two different guys are going back and forth about their view of faith and reason. Might have been three of them.
Mm-hmm.
One of those books that looked at faith and reason.
Yes. In fact, I thought I had that one on my shelf right now. Yeah, here we go. It may have been this one here on three views on
Yes.
faith and reason. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. This is just tremendous. Yeah, and it's a fairly modest
Yeah.
size, so it doesn't get into too much in the weeds. But yeah, the guy that defends the sort of classical view, yeah, it's masterful.
Yeah, it was very good,
Yeah,
very good.
yeah,
And actually,
yeah.
I teach that when I go to South Africa and I'm going to teach a course on apologetics. I deal with faith and reason before we even get into it, so that I kind of
Mm,
set the boundaries, and
good.
I've used that to kind of show this is how we're going to think about this, because a lot
Absolutely.
of them, they think that faith is all you need and you don't use reason. You don't want to use your mind.
Right.
Your intellect gets in the way. And
Yeah, that's
just even
man's wisdom, is what they,
right,
some say. Exactly.
and just discussing what intellect is, again, something that I got from studying philosophy, understanding what intellect is different than intelligence, or
Hmm.
being mind smart. That isn't what intellect means, but
Right.
your ability, your function to know, and that sort of thing. And how do you
Hmm.
know anything? And we talk about all kinds of things. And I find the students there love it. Once
Oh
you
yeah.
once you get
Hmm.
past the terms and you start defining things for them, it really works. And like you, I have a couple of young men. I should be doing Zoom calls with them more often. That
Yes.
we I knew them when they were first year students, and now they're both
That's great.
graduates and in ministry. And yeah, spend
We may know
time with
some of
them.
the same people there. Now, when you go, is it usually the same time during the calendar year, or are you just scattered whenever?
Well, I usually go sometime in February and or first part of March,
Okay.
and then I go back at the end of the summer, last week of
Okay.
August, first part of
Okay.
September. But
All
my
right.
schedule, they'll have me anytime, and
Yeah.
they'll fit me into things, like because I've been doing this a long time, not philosophy and apologetics, but teaching the Bible. And I love hermeneutics.
Hmm.
So I've taught Hebrews to them, John to them.
Man.
I had Isaiah. I did Isaiah, and Isaiah blew me away. I'll tell you.
Mm,
Even in
mm.
15 hours, when John Grobler asked me to teach Isaiah, I thought, oh my gosh, 15 hours on Isaiah, like who are we kidding here? Um, but the Lord just showed me some things to do, and
That's
we
excellent.
we really hit it. And there were people repenting in the class. I mean, there were people who were seeing things about
Now,
salvation,
were
and
you at Living Word?
yeah, that's usually where
Yeah.
I teach.
Yeah.
And
That's I've taught there several times myself. Not Isaiah,
right, but
but yeah.
yeah,
No, that's
and
great.
it's such a great thing. They have me do Luke and Acts, um,
Man, that's rich.
and yeah, that, I'll tell you, gave me a love for biblical theology, just to see God's plan and how Luke basically carved this thing out.
Mm.
And just I come away edified teaching it,
Oh,
and
absolutely. I can see that.
and gives me a view of things, and they love it, because I think a lot of people who go in there, that they have first don't relate to the students. Like I have them all introduce themselves to me, tell me why they're there, and they could say, I don't know why I'm here. That's okay. And
Yeah,
I'm relational. And I've learned a lot about Afrikaans and the Afrikaans people, going there and teaching them and being with them, which has really just opened my heart to help them even more.
absolutely.
And I love it.
That's great.
I'm
I
going
can't wait to
through.
get back.
Yeah,
I usually go in July when it's freezing to death down there,
yeah.
or I am at least.
Well,
It's
it's
like
funny
I'm
that
missing a month of my summer now when I go, but it's certainly
exactly.
worth it. And
Yeah,
Rebecca and I've been able to go together once
Joanne
while
and
we
I
were
did it
there.
once too.
Yeah, it's just rich. I love the people there, and I'm just so
Oh,
excited. I tell them all the time. I say, I brag on what God's doing down here in
yeah,
apologetics and philosophy, especially on the campuses and the
yeah,
university campuses. It's just tremendous. So,
yeah. Simon and
absolutely,
Nell are doing a great work there. They
absolutely, they
really
are.
are. And John Grobler, I mean, his vision for the Bible College, especially among a group of Pentecostal churches that really don't put a whole lot of stock in things like apologetics and philosophy. John does. He's taken
Yeah,
lots of courses at
yeah.
SES, and
He's a good man.
yeah. But yeah, I think I had one more question here.
Sure.
Well, it was about what would you recommend for someone dealing with a person in the Catholic faith? Thomas? I mean, you could always.
Well, there you get into theological issues that are going to. I mean, I have my views, and I teach a little bit of theology. I teach the soteriology class on occasion at Southern Evangelical Seminary, but by and large, I'm not a theologian, and certainly not a Bible scholar. So when there are probably a lot better guests than I to start getting into some of the particular theological distinctions between Catholics and Protestants. And if you want to be inclusive, you can bring in the Eastern Church to have that discussion
Right.
as well. So I'm probably not the best one. I've got opinions, but I'm probably not as knowledgeable about some of the specifics as other guests might be.
Yeah. Well, Richard, this has been rich.
Well,
But
thank you. This has been a blast. I hope we get to do it again sometime.
yeah, I would anytime you'd like to do it. I'd like to have you on again and talk about some of the other things, maybe faith and reason, and go at that. Um,
Absolutely.
and I'll put this. This is on my Facebook page, my ministry page, but it'll go up on my YouTube channel, and I might break it down into two parts, just
All
because
right.
I know people. The first thing people look at a video is how long it is.
How long it is? Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I do the same thing. An
you know.
hour and 20 minutes. Oh no, man, I
Are
can't.
you kidding
No.
me?
Yeah, exactly. I do the same thing,
But
which is a commentary, I think, on us.
yeah,
But
it
I don't want
is.
to go there.
It is. I mean, and I think it's sitting through 3 hours of class. My first year at SES, both semesters, and I did take classes during the winter module, were 4 classes each time. So I was out 4 nights a week, and my mind was blown. It took me about 2 years to assimilate the first semester I was there. I think I'm still getting it. I go over my notes every once in a while. I still have Copleston's volumes of philosophy, and that's my go-to one for Thomistic philosophy.
When I was up with you in your conference some years ago, and you had teed up me coming up to talk about, hey, sometimes you got to do the heavy lifting. There's things you got to read in theology and philosophy, but it's worth it. And you were encouraging people.
Yeah.
And then when I got up, I don't know if you remember this, and I actually ended up making some PowerPoint slides that I photoshopped. I said, yeah, Ray's exactly right. There's a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the reading. So you want to start at the beginning, sort of like what you were asking me before about, hey, what can be? I said, yeah, my first foray into philosophy was Plato, Here's a Who. That was one of them. And the other was Green Eggs and Aristotle. So those really got me going. And I actually have a picture, and it looks just like the Dr. Seuss books, but it's got the different title on there.
I'd love to see him.
Yeah, so that's
That's
me.
great. Well, thank you so much, Richard.
You're welcome.
I'm going to
Absolutely.
sign
God
off here,
bless.
but we could stay online for a minute or two.
All right. Sounds great.